Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy's East Asia Strategy Forum. My name is Zach Pakin, and I am a research fellow with IPD in the Canada's Role on the Global Stage program. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you all back this afternoon. Following the two sessions that we had earlier today that focused more on questions of regional security and regional order writ large in the Asia-Pacific region, we are now going to turn our attention specifically to Canada and Canada's role and Canada's interests in the region. And for that, today we are very grateful to have four excellent panelists, three of which are with us right now, and will be joining us, one more who will be joining us shortly. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them and we'll get right into the discussion. Just a reminder to all of our participants today who've joined us, you can join the conversation yourself as well by asking questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I assume everyone is familiar with Zoom now after a year and a half of the pandemic. And alternatively, you are welcome to participate in the public discussion by tweeting out your thoughts using the hashtag EASF2021. So that's East Asia Strategy Forum 2021. So our four panelists joining us today, we have so far the three who are with us are all joining us, I believe, from the West Coast. We have Paul Evans, who is with us from the University of British Columbia. He is a professor there teaching Asian and Trans-Pacific International Relations and is the recently appointed HSBC Chair in Asian Research. Thanks so much for joining us today, Paul. From Victoria, BC, we've got Margaret Cornish, joining us, who is a former Canadian Foreign Service officer, as well as a senior fellow at the Institute of Asian Research at UBC. And she's also a member of IPD's advisory board. Margaret, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And Jeff Reeves is also joining us. He is Vice President of Research and Strategy for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in Vancouver. Jeff, thank you for being with us as well.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Great pleasure. And Jeremy Paul-Teal, who is just joining us right now, our fourth panelist, who I believe would be joining us from Ottawa, so the only one in addition to myself who is not on the left coast. Jeremy is Professor of Political Science at Carleton University in Ottawa, as well as a senior fellow associated with IPD. So without further ado, Paul, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. There's been a report recently in the Globe and Mail that Canada is proceeding with its development of a so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, that deliberations on this have advanced within the Department of Foreign Affairs, and that a number of high-profile, including ex-ambassadors, are involved in the process. So I'm wondering if you could help us to understand what should we hope to see in this strategy in particular? What would be a sign of a successful and useful strategy?
Well, thank you, Zach, and thank you for reminding the audience today that some of us are on the wet coast. We have had the proverbial biblical floods here that are having a major impact on a lot of people, a lot of animals, and on our supply chains going forward. This is a significant event which is going to take some time to recover from. Meantime, Ottawa is alive with the discussion of what an Indo-Pacific strategy might look like. Sometimes we're hearing it might not be an Indo-Pacific strategy, but an Asia-Pacific strategy. But I think the leaning is towards the frame of Indo-Pacific. And it has been something that has been studied, looked at in different formulations, sometimes starting as a China strategy or China approach, but then taking into account new factors in the region, is being reframed as, at this stage, the most popular version is Indo-Pacific. There have been discussions inside government, different agencies talking about this, and then around it. Groups like the Asia Pacific Foundation did a fascinating workshop a couple of years ago, looking at what some of the issues are. So I think that the biggest thing we'll be watching for is when this might be released. I imagine there will be more discussion of it before whatever the government comes up with will be publicly announced, a big statement. I think that's a little bit further down the line. But there's a lot at stake in this. And I would say that in part, it's simply about the title and whether we're going to be looking at something that is Indo-Pacific, an Asia-Pacific frame to it, which is quite different, as I'm sure the other panelists were raised, or even a Euro-Asian perspective. The framing of the region now reflects the complexities of the kind of tectonic shifts that are taking place in economic interactions, in technology, but fundamentally around the US-China relationship. And how it is playing out will be the big question built into even just the name of what we're going to identify as this new strategy.
Thanks very much, Paul. Jeff, what are you keeping an eye out for in particular as it relates to this strategy?
Sure. I completely agree with Paul that how the government decides to move forward around nomenclature is going to be critical. Whether this is an Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific strategy carries huge strategic connotations, many kind of strategic consequences, of course, opportunities one way or the other, many of which will need to be balanced, which I think will have to be addressed in any Indo-Pacific strategy, right? So first and foremost, what I'd like to see is a clear articulation of why the government opted for the Indo-Pacific over the Asia-Pacific. Specifically what they think that brings in terms of strategic values and strategic opportunities for Canada in the Asian region. From what I've heard, and again, I don't have any particular insight into the process, just hearing through networks and through discussions, that much of the Indo-Pacific strategy will be focused on deepening Canadian ties with Southeast Asia, for instance, pursuing a free trade agreement with ASEAN, with Indonesia, developing deeper strategic partnerships with Vietnam. I think thinking, again, kind of adopting a Western model, that Vietnam is moving more towards a Western aligned strategic partner, which I think is a mistake. And I think it would be an interesting further discussion later on in this panel. Focusing on relations with Japan, focusing on deepening relations with Australia, looking at India as a potential partner. All of those things, I think, could be managed through an Asia-Pacific approach. In fact, having worked on the Asia-Pacific for the last 10 years, every single one of those issues I've dealt with, I've looked at, I've engaged with through the lens of an Asia-Pacific strategic strategic approach, a geographic reference area. So I'd really like to see in any Indo-Pacific strategy a clear articulation of what advantages come from framing that engagement, that type of engagement, those priorities in an Indo-Pacific geographic reference area rather than an Asia-Pacific area. I imagine what we're going to see is that the choice of an Indo-Pacific was to address the opportunities around like-minded partnerships with Western states in particular, focusing on transatlantic relations and US relations, and translating Canadian opportunities, using those relationships as a force multiplier within the Asia-Pacific region. But then again, I'd also like to see how we're going to mitigate some of the negative outcomes to an Indo-Pacific alignment, in particular, the fact that a lot of those like-minded states are former colonial powers in the Asia-Pacific. When you look at Europe in particular, the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the United States, Japan, of course, has a very unique role in the Asia-Pacific that I think would need to be clearly articulated and addressed. I'd also like to see within any Indo-Pacific strategy a understanding of how to avoid internationalization of some regional issues. In particular, when we look at Taiwan, when we look at issues in Northeast Asia around the DPRK and nuclearization, when we look at the South China Sea, when we look at territorial disputes, issues around cyber, issues around transnational crime within the region. How do we avoid making those global security issues and remain focused on identifying them as localized security challenges in many instances that require very localized responses? And I think that has to be well worked into any strategy going forward. But I could go on, but I think we have a lot more time to discuss this. Those are kind of my initial thoughts around that.
Thank you, Jeff. That's very useful. Margaret, what is your view on the Asia-Pacific versus Indo-Pacific framing? Are there more risks or more rewards in the Indo-Pacific nomenclature for Canada?
Oh, I think Asia-Pacific is the appropriate approach. But given if it has to be a federal and free and open and Indo-Pacific formulation, which the Canadian government may feel a little cornered into accepting, I think it can still focus on the values and the interests of ASEAN-centered Asia rather than a US-centered Asia. So I think what I'm looking for is recognition that our interest is a relatively small trading nation dependent on foreign trade and foreign capital, global stability, and an evolving system of rules with the buy-in from the rest, i.e. the non-Western world, and not just the wealthy countries in the world. And I think that if we could bring ourselves to see our situation in that light, we would be doing ourselves a great favor. I think Canadians haven't really accepted being a global, being an Asia-facing country. And that's something that the government, it's not the government's fault that we don't. We have to recognize governments are limited in what they can do, but much has to be done in Canada to focus on the Pacific. Despite some lip service, we're a long way from where we can focus on the Pacific. And focus on continuing support. I'd like to see continuing support to adapt to the new realities globally for Canadian business. Our embassies in the region provide very effective support for Canadian business, but it's not called on often enough. Canadian business itself is not as focused or as specific as it needs to be eventually. So those are rather high-level comments rather than Jeffrey's detail, but that's my approach.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Jeremy, over to you. I'm wondering how you understand this term of Indo-Pacific, because its inherent maritime imagery seems to inherently convey some sort of containment of China. And it's perhaps no accident that this terminology of Indo-Pacific has become more and more common in recent years as China's power has become much more explicit, and assertive, on the regional stage. Do you agree with that conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific, or is it possible to imagine a more inclusive understanding of the term Indo-Pacific that does accord some sort of regional place for China?
Well, obviously I would like to see that, but the point is, you're right. You stole the words from my mouth. The framing of Indo-Pacific is a containment of China framing. But we also have to remember that the Asia-Pacific was a US-centered concept. It grew out of the end of the Pacific War and the idea that the United States is a Pacific power. So the Asia-Pacific, although there may be other kinds of antecedents going back to the Manila galleons of the Spanish Empire, but in fact, the Asia-Pacific was a US-centric proposition. So in that sense, the problem is not so much the concept itself, but the framing and what it's intended to convey. And also, and both the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific are US-centered propositions. Now, so therefore, going back to the original question, what would I like to see? Obviously, I'd like to see a framing of our Pacific strategy, which as Margaret Cornish, finally recognized that we are a Pacific country to stay, and not sometimes.
In and out.
And secondly, that we are not necessarily aiming to be a player in strategic competition with China. And therefore, so the first, in other words, I'd like the former proposition that Canada is a Pacific power to be the primary motivator, and the framing of the geographic formulation of what the thing we're looking towards as a secondary factor, and then to look at it that way. The problem is, much of this is motivated by fear of missing out. That Canada is worried that as the rise of China has precipitated a vigorous American response, and we see ourselves as a close ally of the United States. The problem is that we now fear being marginalized, not just globally, but marginalized as a US ally. That's a bad reason to formulate a strategy. it should be a strategy based on Canadian interests, but that seems to be lost in the entire framing.
Paul, I saw you shaking your head a little bit before about the framing of, or definition rather, of Asia Pacific versus Indo-Pacific. Do you want to come in quickly and clarify, your understanding of the two concepts?
I do, because the idea of Asia Pacific, as it filtered into our world, really came from 1988, 89, 90, the end of the Cold War. And the look at what kinds of trade arrangements could be put in place, what kinds of new institutions. We built APEC, we built some ASEAN-centered organizations. But the key to it was open regionalism. The concept was open interconnections. And the subtext of that was that it would include China rather than exclude China. And it was also about cooperative security, the idea that security in the region would be built with others rather than against them. Simple propositions. And curiously, the two strongest advocates of Asia Pacific in that early incarnation were Japan and Australia. We wouldn't have had APEC without Japan and Australia. And the curiosity is now, whatever we are, 23 years later, is that I got my math right, 30 years later.
33 years, yeah.
Yeah, I've got to, not my strength. 30 years later, we have those two countries who are strong advocates of an Indo-Pacific frame. And the principal difference is related to how to deal with China and what kind of trading arrangements, how they should be centered. I'd have a little bit of difference with some of the other panelists on this. I think the challenge we face in this is the vocabulary of Indo-Pacific is fine if we can define it with Asia-Pacific characteristics. And I must say that I think the Japanese conception of Indo-Pacific is one that, to me, is much more consonant with that value or that value proposition than is the Australian or than is the American. And so we're going to see Indo-Pacific come in different shades. And the key is how clever and how systematic our leaders are going to be in defining exactly what that Indo-Pacific with Asia-Pacific characteristics look like. Because I think there is ambivalence in Ottawa about lining up for what some of my colleagues called containment of China. I don't think Indo-Pacific, it is in some versions, but it is about constraints of China. And how exactly we're going to position on that is, we need a front row seat.
Jeff, you wanted to come in.
I think everything Paul said is spot on. The only point I wanted to make is just kind of a two-finger comment on this is when you look at Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific, I think the important, at least for me, takeaway is that these are political constructs, right? These are not geographically determined areas, and they wax and wane depending on power dynamics at the time, depending on state relations and priorities and institutions, and I guess what we could call, order, which is another really loaded term that's now being used quite freely, rules-based order, without a lot of reference to exactly what we're talking about. But I think in terms of adopting language around an Indo-Pacific, we have to understand that in doing so, whether or not it's our intention, as Canadian strategic community or the strategic thinkers or government officials or policymakers, that there is a broader kind of conceptual idea of what an Indo-Pacific constitutes out there that we necessarily adopt in using the language. We can't simply just replace Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific as valueless terms. They do have inherent meaning to them. And while we like to feel that we can control the narrative by saying we buy into this version of the Indo-Pacific, but not this version of the Indo-Pacific, a lot of that depends on how the recipient views the Indo-Pacific, right? And unfortunately, when you look at narratives and how they're used strategically, it's quite often the hegemon's narrative that becomes the predominant use of the term. And of course, if you look at how the United States is using the Indo-Pacific, it's very much about aligning partners in the region and outside of the region to be active within the Asian region in order to maintain U.S. predominance and, you can say, containment of China. I think that's a really interesting line of argument. I don't know if this is all about containment of China, but it certainly, at least from my perspective, is about Western predominance and the maintenance of Western leadership in the Asia Pacific. So that was a little bit more than two fingers, but I think it's an important point to make. These are not terms that we can just replace one with the other without understanding the broader context.
All right. Thank you very much for your opening salvos. I'd like to move on now to the question of Canada's interests, and really just to return to first principles and think about this in the abstract. Michael Swain on the panel that we just had before this one had a point and made a point that was that is often made, namely many different countries in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region don't want to choose between the United States and China. And the result of that is a more complex and more fluid regional arrangement than Canada perhaps is accustomed to seeing elsewhere, which got me thinking. In the Euro-Atlantic theater, there's NATO and there's Russia. Obviously, it's more complex than that, but nonetheless, there is that binary dynamic, and it has made Canada's contributions to regional security issues in the Euro-Atlantic theater a lot more straightforward. How can we contribute to NATO, basically? Now that we're turning our attention gradually towards the Pacific, it looks like we're entering a much more complex regional security environment. Which means that we're going to have a much more nuanced strategy about how to deal with that and to identify our interests in a much more a careful manner than perhaps we have in previous instances of Canadian involvement in other theaters. So let's start again with Paul here. Could you help us to understand, in your view, what are Canada's core interests in this region versus perhaps secondary interests or nice to haves?
If we're looking at the slide into Cold War 2.0 as a way of framing the strategic competition between the United States and China, we are at a point where I think the fundamental question is whether we see our future connections in this to be named region, but in this Indo-Pacific frame. Do we see it as essentially moving to an alliance-based friends and enemies conception of the order, as in some ways we did certainly with NATO and the anti-Soviet period? Do we see it as essentially an era of the alliances on steroid in the region? Or do we see it as an era of alignment? I think those are the Canadian choices. Are we going to want to line up with our friends and the like-minded in a series of institutions and collaborations? Do we want to be into the Quad? Do we want something like an AUKUS agreement? The logic to those does relate to alliances, and alliances that identify a common threat. Or do we think, and I think the important strategic choice, or do we want to have alignment with different players, different constellations for different purposes? Doesn't mean being equidistant. So a number of things we'd like to collaborate with our alliance friends on, specific activities. But in general terms, we need a mechanism for providing distance, something between us and the alliance strategy. Now, some say there's no room for that anymore, that the middle power is dead because there's no middle left. I think that's an overstatement. I think that there is a middle left, and that, as some have said earlier in this discussion, we at least see the best of ASEAN thinking in what that middle world could look like. So we align with ASEAN in some ways, or individual states there, but rather than reject the alliance. And I think this is not into our hard material interests, but it is in our interest if we're trying to prevent war in the Pacific, if we're trying to contribute to human security in that, whatever part of the world that is. And if we're trying to deal with transnational issues. I just pray we can spend more time actually working on climate issues than we are working on nuclear submarine issues as a Canadian priority.
Margaret, Paul just mentioned the desire that Canada should have to avoid a Cold War between the United States and China in the region. Is that a core Canadian interest in your view? Or does Canada really not have any core interests besides getting along with the United States?
Oh, I would say I share much of what Paul has just said. that our core interest is one to pursue our economic interest in Asia, and that requires that there is not a contention between the Cold War between the United States and China. So I see our interests as aligning with the middle powers, which are the middle powers in the world are shifted to being middle powers in Asia, by and large, plus one or two states in Europe. That it's connection with those countries that we need to make and develop. So what the strategy we want to see, whether we call it free and open, or we need it to be focused on stable and inclusive. And the values, these are the values of the ASEAN states and of ASEAN as a whole. So I think it's pretty clear our alliance needs to be, let's not call it an alliance, our connections need to be with those countries, and to avoid any, it's going to take great tact for this strategy to say that they're not interested in the FOIP, in free and open Indo-Pacific. It's what we need to not identify with that in the US strategy.
Both of your responses, sorry, go ahead.
We need to keep a low profile, not express ourselves too strongly in any situation, and just try to get along under the radar. That's my not very attractive strategy.
Okay, let's go. Well, we got lots of time to unpack it still, so let's go to Jeff next. Both of Paul's and Margaret's responses just now have talked about which partners we need to identify to pursue our interests in the region. Canada, for example, is now a dialogue partner with ASEAN. But at the same time, Jeff, do you think that the principle of ASEAN centrality makes it very difficult for us to partner with them in shaping regional order in any substantial fashion? Does that not sort of freeze sort of the nature of regional order to a certain extent?
No, I think, fundamentally, I agree with Paul and Margaret on the idea that when we look at kind of national interests in the region, really what we're looking at is, the opportunity to expand Canada's economic opportunities in the region, the need to ensure regional stability in order for those economic relationships to remain robust and sustainable. And then ultimately, if you look at it in terms of what states largely try to accomplish through their national interest, the development of what you could call prestige or soft power or influence, resulting for your engagement in economics and security dialogues. And so when you look around the Asian region and you think, who are the right partners? It's pretty clear, at least from my perspective, because, for example, ASEAN and the ASEAN member states are some of the fastest growing economies, not only in the Asia Pacific, but in the world. The demographics are all in the right places. Consumption is growing. Intra-regional trade is flying forward with respect to how much capital is moving between different ASEAN member states, one or the other. Singapore now has become a provider of capital throughout the region rather than a recipient of Western capital. So we're seeing more and more economic regionalization centered on ASEAN, simply because ASEAN is at the center of the Asia Pacific. Southeast Asia is front and center in all of the Asia Pacific regional states development priorities and strategies. If you look at what South Korea is doing with its new southbound policy, it's really focused on integration with ASEAN and ASEAN member states. Japan, in its free and open Indo-Pacific, has also identified Southeast Asia and ASEAN as the economic center of gravity where it wants to have deeper engagement. Even the European Union, with its Indo-Pacific strategy, or the UK with its global Britain strategy, they're all looking at ASEAN and Southeast Asia as the area where they want to expand economic ties, because there's an understanding that there's opportunity there. So I certainly think that Canada is looking in the right place when it talks about an FTA with ASEAN, for example. And I think within that, an FTA with Indonesia is a really attractive opportunity as well. Indonesia is a huge market, a growing economy, one that I think provides a huge amount of opportunity for Canadian investment and Canadian business opportunities overseas. We have some good early mover advantage about being a part of the CPTPP. I think that is something that we should continue to push on and continue to educate Canadian businesses around opportunities that exist through there. I think that when you look at how the region is moving, RCEP is another really, I think, important institution that's gaining, I think, a lot of influence and is leading to interesting developments around digital trade, for instance, and the development of standards and how we're thinking about these issues. So certainly, I think when we prioritize how Canada can engage in the Asia Pacific to achieve what I would say are its broader national interests, Southeast Asia is going to be front and center of that. Integration in regional institutions, free trade agreements, all of these components, I think, are essential to a really sustainable Canadian engagement strategy in the region.
Gotcha. You mentioned the CTPPP, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, I want to go over to Jeremy and to count on your expertise as a sinologist and to help us understand what our core interests are vis-a-vis China. Do we have an interest in Canada in ensuring that we continue to do a number of things with China going forward, or actually is combating the security implications of China's rise a more important consideration for Canada at this point in time? And perhaps there's sort of a natural follow-up that goes with that. Is it possible to combat some of these security implications of China's rise while at the same time maintaining good relations with China, as you said, making it clear that we are, to the Chinese leadership, that we are not, in fact, joining this major security competition in the region that is increasingly becoming zero-sum? Is there room for nuance anymore, or is the time for that to a certain extent past?
The room for nuance is declining, but it's absolutely necessary, because China is the world's second largest economic power. It's the world's largest manufacturer. What it means, actually, the idea that somehow we can have a free trade agreement with ASEAN as an alternative to trading with China is an absurd one, given that China is a core member of the RCEP and all the value chains are regional. So actually what happens is if we want to go that route, we actually end up isolating ourselves from Trans-Pacific value chains. We isolate ourselves from Trans-Pacific value chains. We actually marginalize ourselves as a manufacturing power. So, I mean, that's the simple logic. The other thing I want you to bear in mind, the Cold War, and the Cold War is a kind of lazy man's term for we want to oppose China, but we don't want World War III. Okay, now, the problem, let's go back here. Winston Churchill, Fulton, Missouri speech was, "The Iron Curtain has fallen over Eastern Europe." It's Stalin who brought down the Iron Curtain. Here, the Cold War 2.0 seems to be about some people in the United States wanting to bring down their own Iron Curtain in terms of cooperation with China. The question is whether it's workable or not, is even feasible or not. Many people, even Joseph Nye, even Joe Nye says it's not feasible. I'm having terrible technical difficulties here. Anyhow, even Joe Nye
you're demonstrating just how easy it is for a regional order to collapse. Some mistakes are. Anyhow,
point is that there's some absurdities involved in this proposition, and we have to look at our interests in terms. And the other aspect is that China, being the world's second largest economic power, is also one of the world's biggest providers of global public goods. So the issue, the fundamental issue, is that and there's a subsidiary issue here. If we cannot partner effectively with China on some issues, we're effectively giving up on being a global presence. That's the point. Second part is, in the first view that Paul mentioned of the alliance view of the Indo-Pacific, of a closed shop kind of view. What we run the danger of is that the United States still recognizes it has to cooperate with China. That's what the whole talk was yesterday or the night before, depending on which time zone you're in. But the problem is, if we then see ourselves as simply in alignment with the United States in its view, what will happen is that the United States will be able to cooperate with China over our heads on many economic issues, and we'll be frozen out, which marginalizes us further as an economic power. So I think we need a little bit more clear thinking on what this all means.
Right.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Over to Paul now on, let's talk about the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership for a moment. The next panel that we're going to have is going to get into the economic dimension of this agreement and of the Canada-China relationship as well. But I'm wondering if we could just talk about the strategic implications to a certain extent of China's application to join the CPTPP. Canada is the second largest economy within this trade agreement right now, given the withdrawal of the United States. So we presumably have a significant role to play in determining whether or not they should join. Does Canada, in your view, have a strong interest in finding some sort of way to reach an accommodation, between China and China's normative practices and economic practices, and the stipulations of the CPTPP for strategic reasons?
Well, I think you're right, Zach, that this is going to be perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most important real questions, not just around the framing and the architecture, but the choices that we're going to be engaged in the next few months, and that the government will have to look at in a consistent way. And the CPTPP is one heck of a complicated issue from the angle of whether China should be, its request to join the CPTPP should be taken seriously. There's various ways different countries are lining up on this one. Canada a little bit unclear, but to me it is a bellwether for what Ottawa will do and what we think a variety of countries are going to do on the question of the kind of order we're going to have going forward. I hope that Ottawa will look at this, finesse it around the edges, but on balance say, let's put China to the test. If it would like to apply, is it willing to live by CPTPP rules? Recognizing that there would be some give and take in all of that, as there was when China was brought into the WTO. But the issue beneath the surface on it is not something that simple. This is about power politics. And if the United States says no to wanting China in the CPTPP, if they are making clear, even if they're not a member, which the United States is not, that this kind of thing would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, and the kind of arguments that support that. China can't be trusted. It will make promises and not live by them. A variety of arguments that are already being used. But if we go back to Michael Swain's question, if we're forced to choose, and I think this is going to be a telling issue in US-Canada relations, is how much pressure the Americans are going to put on us to avoid, to not take the kinds of simple-minded steps that I just suggested, which is let's put China to the test on this. Let's see if they're willing to live by it. I don't think America is going to take that. The United States is going to take that as a satisfactory answer. Then we get into the issue of how it's going to play out maybe in the Three Amigos discussion that is going on as we speak, whether in looking forward, Canada is going to, on these matters, on the big trade policy issues, trade architecture issues, is going to not only force us, will force us to take positions that we otherwise wouldn't want to. It's not a matter of do we want to choose or not, but can we be forced to make a choice in a particular direction? And that will be a test of Ottawa in a big way.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions for Jeff. One is a follow-up to this, and I guess since Paul, you brought up the Three Amigos, I'm wondering, Jeff, if you're concerned at all that if Canada supported at some point China's application to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whether the United States would invoke Section 3210 of the USMCA, recently agreed USMCA deal, that would prevent Canada from signing a free trade agreement with a so-called non-market economy. Is that something that you're concerned about at all? And a second question from the audience, which is not entirely unrelated, is how, in your view, do you think Canada should be approaching the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative?
Sure, big questions. And I think maybe I'll take one step back and add to something that Paul said. I think when we look at the CPTPP, I think it's important to not just see it in isolation, right? It's part of what's essentially a growing, already established economic infrastructure and architecture across the Asia Pacific that doesn't involve either the largest Indo-Pacific, the Indo side of the largest economy from India, or the largest economy from the Pacific, right? So if we talk about the Indo-Pacific, both of those largest economies are missing from this emerging economic architecture that's focused around Southeast Asia and the Asia-Pacific. That's the ASEAN Economic Community, that's the CPTPP, that's RCEP, and of course, that's the BRI. And I think maybe that's a good segue to the question about how we should think about the BRI. I think that when you look at, for example, how other regional states are approaching the BRI, there is large regional buy-in to the idea that BRI investment and engagement is largely beneficial when and where it's managed appropriately. And China's been very pragmatic in managing its approach to the BRI. The narrative around debt trap diplomacy, the narrative around exporting Chinese labor to developing countries and using the BRI as a means to address labor issues within China's domestic market has been largely debunked by a lot of really very serious good scholarship that looks at the global South and Chinese engagement with the global South. There's been some great polling out recently, most recently the Afrobarometer survey that just came out a couple of days ago that pointed to the fact that most recipient countries of the BRI see it in largely positive terms. They see Chinese developed influence attached to the BRI in largely positive terms, not unproblematic, but certainly see China as being more thoughtful around how to engage and more adaptive to making sure that the BRI investments and activities on the ground are in line with issues that we would call, environmental social governance issues, ESG type, concerns around the externalities that result for BRI engagement, for example. Even Japan, under the Abe administration, identified the potential for Japan to cooperate with BRI investment through its free and open Indo-Pacific. Again, South Korea looks at the BRI and says, hey, this is an opportunity for further regional integration. The ASEAN Economic Community blueprint is built around BRI cooperation. So I guess my answer of whether or not Canada should be involved in BRI projects or activities is, if you're not, you're going to be largely outside the rest of the Asia Pacific in terms of how it's engaging with China and how it sees the BRI. And that will just add to the overall perception that Canada is an outsider power that is unwilling to play by local rules and that doesn't understand regional sentiments or regional narratives around things like Chinese investment and engagement. In terms of whether or not the United States would then penalize Canada in terms of its deeper economic relations, that would be a huge indicator, I think, that Canada needs to rethink some of its strategic approach to the United States. Seeing that as a potential structural impediment towards deeper Canadian engagement in the Asia Pacific, or whether or not we support China's application to the CPTPP, I think is an indication of the need for a more sophisticated approach to balancing that Canadian involvement with the United States in the Asia Pacific and Canadian national interests as they stand outside of Canada-US relations. So a bit of a dodge on that last bit of the question. It's a hard one to answer.
For sure. Well, we'll dig into it some more as well. Let's go over to Margaret, though. How do you view this triangular relationship between Canada, the United States, and China? And where, if anywhere, does our room for maneuver exist?
Well, on the BRI, I really would mirror the view of Jeffrey that the inability to see the BRI except through an American lens is a deep weakness on the part of Canadian society and especially its media. So as Jeff made the point that much of the criticism is debunked or undermined in any event by serious scholarship. So I think that's pretty clear. With respect to the CPTPP, I think the comment that it's going to be a huge test is an accurate one, but Canada just has to come to terms with we're a minor power to both the superpowers, to both China and to the United States. And if you don't actually take a stand at some point on one or two issues, then you might as well be a vassal state. So I would suggest it's going to be interesting, but we need to start to lay the groundwork for it in our relationship with the United States now. If we don't have any independence from the United States with respect to China, we might as well sort of fold our tent.
And Jeremy, there's an argument that's out there that says that there might not be much of a cost to decoupling economically with China at all, right? They say, for example, so well, let me play the devil's advocate and make, right. Well, let me make the case, which is that the United States, for example, about half has twice the share of its own trade with China that Canada has with China, and there's also an argument to be made that the future of supply chains is local, et cetera, and so that the world in some respects is getting smaller rather than bigger. So what do you say to those who say that, in fact, and there's another argument as well, of course, which is that look at Australia. Australia is currently standing up to China, and it's doing just fine. So what is your view on this? Why do you think that perspective is wrong?
Let's take one of the biggest industries in our biggest province where I'm sitting right now, the auto industry. The auto industry is going to be moving towards electric vehicles over the next 10 years. China is the world's largest EVA producer and is actually one of its leading technology innovators in terms of battery technology and others. The problem, and auto parts are a huge part of Canadian manufacturing. The problem is that the internal combustion engine is a very complicated thing, where electric motors are much simpler. So in fact, there'll be fewer parts in the future cars. And the parts that are most valuable and most difficult are the ones which the Chinese have been working on most intensively, that is to say, the battery technology. And so so we may be able to preserve one or two assembly plants in Ontario if we do that, but if we get frozen out of much of the other parts of the supply chain, well, that's part of our advanced manufacturing. Now, Australia has made a bet on stopping and not being a manufacturing economy anymore and being basically a commodity producer. They've made that bet. They made that bet a long time ago. Canada hasn't made that bet, and most of us don't want to see Canada make that bet. Yes, if you're a commodity producer, someone will always buy your commodities at a price. The price may go up and down, it may go low, but somebody will produce your commodities. But is that how we will maintain our standard of living in Canada? Is that how we will be a high-tech economy? If we confine ourselves to the lowest end of the value chain, at producing at whatever price anybody will take? And if we then, but I want to look at the two logics that we've talked about here. If the logic is simply that we have to align ourselves with the United States with whatever the United States wants to do technologically about its competition with China, but they will cooperate. In other words, we will be a client state of the United States, not a middle power at all. And we will be confined to the areas of the economic activities that the United States will allow us to undertake. Is that where our future lies? And and the idea that somehow the Chinese market is also the world's second largest market. Okay, so somehow we're going to cut out the world's second largest market, and we're going to try to be a wealthy country. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
So let's go over to Paul here for a second. It was a two-finger intervention. Yes, let's stay on this topic because as I alluded to before, about 8% of U.S. trade is with China, but only about 4% or 5% of Canadian trade is with China. So in that sense, we're much less vulnerable. And Australia has something like, I believe, 35 or 40% of its exports that go to China. They are far and away their number one trading partner. That is certainly not the case, when it comes to the Canada-China relationship. So what do we really have to fear? What are the actual strategic or negative strategic consequences, I should ask plainly, of Canada-China decoupling in the economic realm for Canada?
Okay, can I add something here?
Well, let's let Paul come in first, and then you can come back, and then we'll go to Jeffrey. Okay.
I don't think the fundamental issue that we really confront is a full scope decoupling from China.
No.
What we are talking about and where the hard choices are going to be made is around selective decoupling in particular sectors. And there Jeremy puts his finger directly on the key one, which is high technology. We're going to face this one with our series of Huawei decisions that start with the 5G issue. But more broadly, that then get into what we are going to do in terms of university connections with China in high-tech research. If we follow the American line fully, we of securitizing many ranges of fields in high tech. And 5G Huawei is just one example of 100. But as America is defining 13 or 14 sectors now as a being of security interest, and not just being related to military security or civil military fusion, but now in the context of maintaining American dominance in strategic industries of the fourth industrial revolution. That is the challenge ahead. And as I speak with policymakers in Ottawa and frame this around not just the immediate choice, but what future do we want to see for technology, for science? Do we want to see it securitized? If so, and there's a lot of pressure to do that, then we do align on an alliance basis with our American friends and hope for the best. If, on the other hand, we can make a realistic calculation that the world isn't going to go along with selective decoupling, maybe the Australians, maybe a couple of others in the Anglosphere, but the vast majority of the world isn't. The battle here is over the future of open globalization in high tech, in research, et cetera. And that's what I think is the problem. We're under American pressure on a specific issue when the bigger picture is one that I don't think a lot of Canadians or Canadian policymakers would like to go down that path of something other than a very narrow selective decoupling.
Jeremy, did you still have something to add?
I just wanted to say that simply that China is the number one trading partner of more countries than the United States is, and it is also a technology innovator today. It's heavily, and it has these big trade agreements in Asia. It's going to be a standard setter. So in a whole series of technology, it already is. So what happens is that if you go down this road, that we are actually outside the standard setting frame, that we in effect we make ourselves unable to participate in value chains. What kind of future does that leave for Canada?
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, exactly on that point. There are a number of standards areas where we do not want China's standards to be the standards, not just because the Americans don't want them, but because there are areas where what China wants to do in certain areas, we don't think is good for the global economy. We don't think it's good for us. So my point is on this, we have to do it issue by issue. And rather than frame it as opposing China and every place and lining up with the Americans and some of our other friends, we need to look at this on an issue-specific calculation. And I still think Asia-Pacific is a better framework than Indo-Pacific in framing who our friends are in many of these matters.
Jeff has...
No, I would just kind of circle back and raise the issue of Australia and Zach, I think you said, look, Australia's been able to manage this well and, serves as a good model. We've been looking at Australia, I think, for a long time as a model of what Canada should be doing in the Asia Pacific around Asia literacy, around engagement with ASEAN. I think increasingly under the Morrison government in particular, Australia serves as a prime example of what not to do and some of the challenges around the approaches that it's taken. If you do look at the decision to strike out and essentially adopt a foreign policy towards China that's primarily adversarial at its heart, I mean, what eventually this has meant is that Australia's become more isolated in terms of its strategic opportunity, and that its room for maneuver has been resultingly limited. If you look at some of the regional dialogue that started to come around after the AUKUS announcement, in particular from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from Thailand, there was a lot of reference again to Australia being part of this Anglosphere or Anglo-Saxon approach to the Asia-Pacific region that really cast Australia as an outsider power within the Asia-Pacific. And there were a lot of red flags raised around Australia's role within Southeast Asia and with the South China Sea in particular, whether or not it was contributing to stability or whether or not it was advancing Western hegemony in the Southeast Asian theater. That's a long-term reputational cost to Australia that's going to need to be managed beyond the Morrison administration. Whatever new government adopts Australia's strategic position will have to deal with those ties, including the breakdown in relations with China. And I'd say the last thing that needs to be really closely watched is as this containment of China, or China as a strategic challenger, or China as a revisionist state, is that narrative has permeated the Australian political discourse. It's had really negative effects on Australians of Chinese descent. And we've seen a huge uptick in anti-Chinese sentiment among the Australian population that's worked its way up to members of parliament that have been called out for their Chinese background and put on the spot to actually renounce China in order to demonstrate a larger kind of commitment to the Australian strategic vision of the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a lot of problems that are starting to percolate up from the position that Australia has taken that are good warning signals for Canada about becoming over-reliant on the US as a strategic partner.
Also, Jeff, I've got a follow-up for you on that, actually. You're right that we always have historically looked to Australia as being the country that had made a conscious strategic decision to be an integral part of Asia, that had adopted a national language learning initiative in order to facilitate that integration into the Asian region. But now, as you're saying, they serve as an example of what not to do. So what's your advice to policymakers in Ottawa about how we can avoid repeating the mistakes that Australia has made, especially since we're kind of new to the region to a certain extent? We're just getting started in the region, at least on strategic questions.
Right. I think fundamental to that is decoupling, at least from our strategic view, this idea that we have to navigate the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific with respect to sort of a triangularization of how Canada engages with the United States and China, right? We don't need to see all of our engagement with China through the lens of our partnership with the United States. And we don't need to look at the United States and always reference back to how should we then engage with China. I think we just need to maintain, as Paul has said, as Jeremy said, as Margaret have all said, the need to make individual specific, to maintain the opportunity to have that individual specific issue area opportunity for engagement with both the United States and China, understanding, of course, that geographically we're going to be tied much closer to the United States market, and there's going to be equidistance is something that we can't hope to achieve between the US and China, strategically speaking. But maintaining room for maneuver, maintaining autonomy within the Asia-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific region is critical to maintaining and achieving Canadian national interests defined in economic security or soft power prestige terms. And the more that you become aligned with the United States and are seen from other regional actors as being overly committed to one strategic side over the other, the more the region will start to turn against you as well, right? I don't think that there's a lot of appetite. We often say, Southeast Asian states don't want to align against the United States and China. Well, neither do they want other states in the region to start to create spheres of influence by aligning, because they see that as fundamentally destabilizing to the overall regional security architecture. So there is a prioritization among states that we all, especially the small and medium powers, maintain stability by maintaining, omnidirectional diplomacy where we can, engaging with as many partners and states as we can, and trying to maintain that architecture as a measure to manage great power relations. And so I think that's something that Canadian policymakers should keep in mind.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I think what we should be making clear to our friends in Washington that there is value to the United States in Canada maintaining a slightly different division of the dichotomy of cooperation, competition than the United States have. Because as the United States is looking for what areas to compete in and what areas to cooperate in, and the questions of possibilities of cooperation come in, there is low cost testing of the waters and how to cooperate with China if a country like Canada does it in some areas, and that leads the way and creates an atmosphere of cooperation which can then be expanded without it turning into strategic competition. The cooperation itself become embedded in strategic competition. So I think rather than saying which side are we on, we should say, you know what, we're on your side, but we need to manage this a little bit differently, and we can explore what the limits of cooperation are in ways which are relatively less damaging to the overall strategic framework of the world.
We've got half an hour left, and I'd like to use it to dwell on some of the bigger strategic questions facing Canada and where the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region fits into that. And so, Margaret, I'd like to start with you. We've got a question from the audience, sort of in the intellectual tradition of While Canada Slept by Andrew Cohen, about whether or not Canada can actually survive and achieve its core goals in the world solely by relying on its economic prowess and on economic growth and economic influence. How important is reinvestment in diplomacy and in the military and in the security dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region? How much attention do we really need to pay to those dimensions? Or at this point, are we so far behind and so uninvolved in the security dimension of the region that we might as well just focus on economic questions?
Well, my answer to that is that we haven't got the money to do everything. And not so much that we're behind with respect to the military, but that our interest is not security and military security and securitization in Asia. Far from it. What we then, as just, I think it was Jeremy said, or maybe it was Jeremy, that our interest is not to be seen by the countries of Asia Pacific as being a destabilizer in the region by taking positions on military issues, security issues. We'd be much better. The short answer to this is much better to focus on our economic interest in a low profile, steady way.
Paul, could you help our audience understand, in order to get the region right, do we have to get our China policy right, or is it the other way around? In order to get China right, do we have to have a strategic approach to the entire region?
I think Jeremy put his finger on it earlier. China is at the center of Asia. And I don't mean that in the sense of the Middle Kingdom, but I do mean it in the context of the economies, the kind of weight of interactions. You can't get Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific right without having your approach to China. And in that context, I think that's the fundamental difference between what we want to do in Canada and what our American friends, with a very broad consensus, one we might not like, one we might not appreciate. But the American consensus is that the central factor of the region is the rise of Chinese power and for its implications for America's position, both economically and security-wise. Until we land on that question of, are we going to define China as the strategic competitor, as the enemy, as the adversary? Different things, each of those words mean something rather different, but nevertheless on the same side of the spectrum. You cannot have an Asia-Pacific or an Indo-Pacific strategy till you come down to an answer on that. And the answer that Marc Garneau gave with his famous 4 C's of coexistence, cooperation, competition, and challenge, or countering is what that meant. Sounds nice as a slogan. And I think it suggests the ambiguity of a Canadian answer that might be forthcoming. But it in itself doesn't help us then make the decisions on the case-by-case basis. And that's where the kind of second dimension of a Canadian Indo-Pacific or a Canadian China, boy, do we want strategies? We need about 150 of them from Ottawa. None of them are forthcoming. This is a government, and in fact, we're a country that doesn't do strategies well. But we do need an approach. We do need some kind of foundation for what our basic outlook is going to be. And I think that fundamental question is, where on the spectrum of the C's do we want to place our bets? And I'm hoping it's on the coexistence and cooperation side, but recognizing there are some real challenges with China. And I hope we'll use some of our time today to look at what some of those real things are where pushback is necessary. This doesn't mean accommodating China, but it does mean trying to live with China as we push back.
Seems as if it was just yesterday we were reading about the unveiling of the four Cs, but of course Mark Garneau is no longer our foreign minister because we appear to be changing foreign ministers every 5 seconds in this country. But over to Jeff.
I think this is a good circle back to the initial question about what would you like to see from an Indo-Pacific strategy, because I can't agree with Paul more than the idea that in order to approach the Asian region, you need to get your China policy right? I think it was Richard Armitage that said at one point, in order to get Asia policy right, you need China policy right. In order to get China right, you need to get Asia right. And I think it makes a lot of sense. If you use the Indo-Pacific as your framework, you've added layers of complexity towards this that create so much strategic problematics that you've added a huge amount of work for yourself. For example, if we look at the Asia Pacific, you're already challenged. How do you integrate your policy towards the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia to include China's interests, to include China's influence, its relationships, its networks? How do you understand and navigate that whole complicated mosaic of subnational relationships and nodes that are developing across the Asia Pacific that have China at the center? Right? I mean, that includes your approach to ASEAN. China can be a spoiler for Canada's relationships with ASEAN, particularly if we try to go below the broader or the higher level strategic ASEAN institutions to the working groups where China really has a lot of influence. Now add all of the problem and security challenges in the Indo-Pacific that touch on the Middle East, that touch on the Horn of Africa, that touch on, all of the developing challenges and security challenges in South Asia, including Afghanistan. I mean, that's what you're looking at if you adopt an Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't adopt a vision of the Indo-Pacific that stops at India. A lot of the Indo-Pacific visions do that. Then I get back to the initial point of, well, then why did we call it the Indo-Pacific and not the Asia-Pacific? Because India was already part of the Asia Pacific, in particular with its Act East policy, which prioritizes deeper in Indian economic and political engagement with Southeast Asia. So again, you could play to the Asia Pacific geographic scope strength by focusing on that set of relations and understanding the challenges around China within the Asia Pacific. But if you're going to expand to the Indian Pacific, you're looking at sea lines of communication security, you're looking at energy transit, you're looking at the need to address Chinese influence in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, all of these different challenges that make it so much harder to have a strategy or a grand strategy if you want to address the economic, political, and social sides of engagement as well.
I just want to pick up on something that Paul just said regarding the fact that in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans may not agree on much, but they do agree on the fact that China is a major rising power and challenge, if not threat, that needs to be actively balanced against. Jeremy, you're sitting in Ottawa, and our two main political parties seem not to agree on the question of China and what to do about China, unlike in the United States. So what does that mean for the future of Canada's role in Asia? Can we possibly have a role to play as a serious regional actor if we have a vast swing in our foreign policy priorities vis-a-vis China every 10 years? Does this need to be reconciled somehow? Does there need to be some sort of common ground found between Canada's two biggest parties?
Well, I want to go back to something very basic. China is not an existential threat to Canada. China has no claims on our territory, has no interest in changing our constitutional structure. Even on the areas where people have worries about the Arctic, China doesn't challenge our position on sovereignty in the Arctic. Okay, so this is a very, the problem in the United States is that they see US superiority or dominance in the world as an end in itself and as a badge of America's identity in the world. That is what left and right agree on in different ways. So Biden wants to call it the Alliance of Democracies, which the United States will lead. And so his version is a liberal version of that one. But the idea is who's at the top. Okay. Now, is the Canadian basic interest sustaining full spectrum U.S. superiority? Is our interest in the rules-based international order, certain aspects of liberal international liberalism, where there are serious challenges from China? No question about it. There are serious challenges from China, and there are serious challenges about China breaking rules and things like cybersecurity and all kinds of other areas. But it's not an existential threat. Okay, and there may be reasons why our major opposition party has chosen to view China in this way, partly for domestic purposes, partly for international posturing. But I'm not sure that the majority of Canadians actually see it that way. So I think the first point is to put aside the question of China as an existential threat. Look at what the areas that China challenges us. Look at the areas that we need to cooperate with the United States on. What are our assets in that? I don't know. I mean, we don't have many. We're not willing to invest. We're not going to buy 6 nuclear submarines. Okay, we're not going there. We're not going to pay for it.
Right.
Okay? We're not. But I mean, it may be possible that if at some point, if Indonesia needs help with anti-submarine warfare, maybe Canada can offer help. We have some technical expertise there. Okay, that may be okay. But and some cooperation, some more defense cooperation with Japan, there may be some room for that, but not a full spectrum thing of alignment. And certainly, we're not going to become a major power in the Western Pacific.
And Margaret, did you still want to come in on this?
Well, just to say that Canada's clearly trying to identify where we stand on the spectrum with the United States. The objectives of the free and independent Indo-Pacific are containing China. I'm sorry, now I've forgotten the points, but basically containing China, isolating China within the Asia system, and defending the rules, but defending U.S. primacy in Asia as over China, obviously, and defending the existing U.S. institutions in the region and globally, as distinct from what I think Canadian position would be, not containing China, a rules-based system that is evolving and in which every new power has an opportunity to make a contribution. Those are key differences in our foreign policy approach to vis-a-vis the Americans, and ones in which we're going to have to come to an agreement. We don't agree with the United States on these issues.
Apologies. Just wanted to let everyone know as well, for those who weren't able to attend, seeing as the conversation has veered a little bit into this question of the rules-based international order, we did hold a panel on this recently. So feel free to go to our YouTube page, go to YouTube and look up the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and you'll see a recent discussion that I moderated on Canada's interest in the rules-based international order and how it relates to our relationship with China as well. I have a question for Jeff, and it comes from Jocelyn Coulon, who's a member of our advisory board, and he asks, how can Canada develop an Indo-Pacific strategy if it retains bad relations with India? Which remain frosty to a certain extent. India was one of the countries he mentions that publicly said that it was not going to vote for Canada for a UN Security Council seat. So help us understand the place of India in Canada's strategic thinking vis-a-vis the region.
Let me start by saying there's another challenge about adopting an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is maintaining good relations with India going forward. And in particular, I think the strategic place of India within the broader Indo-Pacific, I think, is really problematic when we're talking. I'll make this point first and then circle back to the Canada-India relationship. But I think when we talk and when we include India as a like-minded state within the Quad, or within the Summit of Democracies, or when we point to Indian democracy as somehow being a condition that aligns India with the rest of the Western world, for lack of a better kind of reference term, we really do disservice to some of the growing authoritarianism in the Modi administration, the creep of Hindu nationalism across the country, sectarian violence that's starting not only across Kashmir, but certainly across the rest of India. Really important and very, I think, concerning human rights developments that are happening in India that we tend to give the country a pass for, because it's so strategically important in our view about how to engage with China and balance Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that's the first point that I would make, is that India as a liberal democracy is a bit of a fallacy. I think it's not what we're actually seeing develop on the ground. And you can see that from Freedom House and from other institutions that judge democratic institutions, that have shown that India is essentially sliding away from democracy towards kind of soft authoritarianism. And, of course, New Delhi's pushed back against that idea, but it's certainly by international standards moving in that direction. So do be aware, if we're going to be critical of China, and I agree with Paul, that we should be open-eye about the challenges that are happening within Chinese society and around Chinese politics. We should do the same for India, and we should do the same for the rest of the region. In terms of Canada-India relations, I mean, it's a challenge, right? One of the big challenges that we look at is there's not as much Canadian presence within India as there is across the rest of the Asia Pacific. When we look, for example, at Canadian firms and Canadian assets and investments in India, it's still well short of other areas within the Asia Pacific where we're active. So we don't have that base of economic ties that we can build, I think, diplomacy and people-to-people exchanges. That's not necessarily true. We have good, I think, engagement across the people-to-people diaspora kind of communities that we can build on. But we are still pretty far afield from being a strategic partner with India. And I think that's something that's, again, a challenge back to the Indo-Pacific. So I'm rambling a bit, but that's the answer.
Thanks very much. We've got under 15 minutes left, and so I want to conclude by going around the horn and asking about where the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region fits into Canada's wider foreign policy strategy. Is it worth, Margaret, in your view, that should Canada reorient itself in a fundamental fashion, you think, in terms of its priorities away from the Euro-Atlantic and towards the Asia-Pacific region, or rather, are we too far behind at this point? Does that not make sense for us to do? And are we geographically insulated enough from the challenges of the Asia-Pacific region that, in fact, we should just continue pitching in where we've been pitching in for a long time in a limited capacity to NATO and just sort of leave it at that? And you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Even from your formulation, it's obvious that Canada is not in a position to behave like that. We have to turn to Asia to build up our future diplomatic profile, economic and political profile. So it's not a possibility to remain. What we can do, especially in terms of engaging with China, is to focus on WTO reform. What's our principal economic interest? It's a small trading nation. It's the rules-based system. And the WTO is a critical factor in that. And we already have the Ottawa Group. I would expand its membership from the Ottawa Group to include more of the Asia members. And there's much that can be done on the next ministerial. We may have two agreements, one on health and trade with respect to the pandemic, trade during the pandemic, and the other is the fisheries subsidies. So if those two pass, there's going to be much more life in the WTO and WTO reform.
Jeremy, our relations with the United States, our role within the United Nations, and our membership in NATO have been long established, institutionalized pillars of Canadian foreign policy. We don't really have that institutionalized culture as it relates to the Asia-Pacific region to the same extent. So, where should the Asia-Pacific region fit into Canada's overall grand strategy, to the extent that Canada does have and should have a grand strategy, that is?
Well, that's the problem. Of course, so there's a drag, or we know what my friend and colleague Kim Nossel said called our strategic anchor in NATO. But how long do you keep repeating the past? I mean, there are institutional reasons why things work out this way. It has to do not just with worldviews and things like that. It also has to do with our institutions. For our underinvestment in our military for so long has meant essentially that our military sees itself as a component of NATO, not as a member of NATO, but as a component of NATO. That is to say, in order for a Canadian military strategy to exist, it has to have a role within NATO. Okay, so that means that we can't see anything else, even though the world is shifting strategically. The United States is shifting strategically. We don't have a role there, and so we continue doing the same thing because that's the only place where we have a role. Now, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm not arguing that we should join AUKUS or necessarily the cause that we're going to invest that thing, but we may want to rethink some of those things and the way in which our institutions work today. So the military sees itself as a component of NATO and its Washington thing. The foreign affairs doesn't necessarily see it that way, but so many of the institutions are going, and Margaret, you were a diplomat, how much of time is spent preparing meetings that go on every year? Well, since there are more of those meetings in the Euro-Atlantic area, then our diplomats in Ottawa are focused on those things, and they have little time left for, yes, there's APEC once a year, but and a couple of other things. So what happens is that the whole strategic focus gets distorted. I think we do need a rethink. I mean, it's not just an Indo-Pacific strategy. We need to actually say to revalue the Pacific in Canadian foreign policy, and that creates that's a whole of government effort. And I'm not sure it's not going to happen over one administration, but perhaps actually maybe this is where the American competition thing might refocus people's minds that maybe this might be a worthwhile exercise.
Margaret, if you want to come in very briefly, and then we'll go to Jeff and Paul to finish up the session.
Yes, just to say that the reaction is not just the whole of government, it's whole of society. It's the sort of thing that the Australians did 30 years ago with respect to Asia. That's all.
Thanks very much. Okay, Jeff, do you think that Canada's foreign policy is due for a revolution in terms of its priorities, or rather is an incremental approach the better way to go as it relates to the Asia Pacific?
Well, I think a revolution is not only unnecessary, but wouldn't be incredibly helpful for engagement in Asia or the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. What is needed is further developing relationships with each individual state within the region, expanding diplomatic relationships, encouraging further people-to-people exchanges, and listening to what the regional priorities are around economic integration, strategic competition, security issues, and identifying specific actionable areas where we can engage with Asian states in order to increase and ensure Asian region stability, right? And some of that can take place within ASEAN, which is the region's predominant, regional institution. Certainly, other aspects of that can take place between bilateral relations, minilateral relations. We can be creative around finding issue areas that are more transnational in nature and engaging in a way that it strengthens those. The region doesn't, I think, clearly doesn't have an equivalent to NATO. And the temptation, I think, in particular, when you look at NATO now, identifying China as a challenge within its broader view of security challenges that it faces, that application of NATO strategic thinking to the Asia Pacific region and the movement of NATO more towards the east is really problematic. And it's something that I think Canadian policymakers and strategic analysts should really look at quite critically and think, what are the cost benefits of that engagement? And I think when we look at the Quad, we should do the same thing. When we think about whether or not we want to be involved in freedom of navigation operations with the US or other external partners like the UK or France or Germany, we should also understand how that is perceived within the Asian region. And I think in order to do that, we have to focus on deepening our engagement with Asian states, with Asian actors, and listen from the region and learn what the strategic priorities are by paying attention to Asian narratives and not Western narratives.
Paul, the last word is yours. How important is the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region for Canada's future security and prosperity? Will our, primary interests lie there, or rather will our, overall foreign policy contribution continue to lie in other parts of the globe?
I'd answer that by asking you to look over my right shoulder in my background today, and the particular map that is on the wall. And it is one that has been in my heart since I was a young prof. And when I headed the Asia Pacific Foundation, I said, the world is a complex place. We're going to live in it in a lot of different ways because of our history, the people we are. We're all immigrants, we come from a lot of different places. But for the 20th century, and now for the 21st, put the Pacific in the center of our map and our thinking. And that it's happening by accrual, inch by inch. Canada is better prepared to interact with Asia than it was a generation ago. But we also are dealing with the rest of the world. And I think it is our curse to be such a cosmopolitan, interconnected place that we don't have a region. I mean, we live in North America, but our region of aspiration is going to I can't see it changing from the global. But as Jeff and others have said, I'd be putting a little bit more weight on the kinds of institutions and processes that are emerging in Asia. And maybe at this stage, they'll have something to say about how we think about the future of NATO. I think seeing it through the Asia lens as compared to the European lens, at least we have to be able to see with two eyes. And that's the challenge of the next decade.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's often said that below the great powers, there are the regional powers. And the old saying is that Canada is a regional power without a region. So you're very right to highlight that. Thank you to all four of you for a very stimulating discussion. I want to let our audience know that our next panel begins at the top of the hour, just in 15 minutes, which will delve into greater depth on the economic dimension of the Canada-China relationship. So please join us for that. If you have not yet registered for that, you are able to do so either in the chat. I believe that the link was just posted, or alternatively, go to our website, peacediplomacy.org, click on the orange tab at the top right of your screen, EASF 2021, and in the program section, you can sign up for that session. That will be a shorter session, just 1 hour and 15 minutes, running from 5 o'clock until 6:15, and it will form a part of our China strategy project, which I will be introducing at the outset of that panel in just 15 minutes time. So to learn more about our China strategy project as well, you can go to our website, again, peacediplomacy.org, go under the projects tab and check out the China strategy project. Paul Evans, Margaret Cornish, Jeffrey Reeves, and Jeremy Poultiel, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Tech.